we've got to talk about day 2 of the Republican National Convention, which will soon be underway in Charlotte, North Carolina. Tonight's lineup will feature speakers from First Lady Melania Trump, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Senator Rand Paul, and President Trump's children, Eric and Tiffany. Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron, who is at the center of the Breonna Taylor case, will also deliver remarks. Now, this all comes after President Trump made history last night, formally accepting his renomination from delegates across the country. Skyler Henry has some of the biggest moments from day 1 of the RNC.
At the first night of the Republican National Convention, President Trump's supporters painted a dire picture of the country if he loses re-election.
Your family will not be safe in the radical Democrats' America.
They want to enslave you to the weak, dependent, liberal, victim ideology to the point that you will not recognize this country or yourself.
After the Democratic National Convention made the case for Joe Biden, Republicans are now building up their candidate.
Donald Trump has always put America first, and he has earned 4 more years as president.
President Trump built the most inclusive economy ever.
The president's eldest son criticized Biden's decades-long career.
Joe Biden is basically the Loch Ness Monster of the swamp.
Presidents typically wait until the end of the convention to make a significant appearance, but Mr. Trump was involved throughout the first day, appearing in videos with healthcare workers and with Americans freed after being held hostage overseas. Speaking to delegates in Charlotte, North Carolina, President Trump accused Democrats of using the coronavirus to their benefit.
To defraud the American people, all of our people, of a fair and free election.
Yesterday, the Biden campaign came out with a list of more than 24 former GOP lawmakers who are endorsing the former vice president.
We need a president who unifies rather than divides.
First Lady Melania Trump is among the speakers at night 2 of the convention. Skyler Henry, CBS News, Washington.
For more on this, let's bring in CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns. So, Caitlin, last night we saw speakers praising President Trump's policies, his first-term actions, and his administration's response to the pandemic. Let me just remind everybody that more than 177,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. Republicans also warned of a dystopian socialist America emerging if Joe Biden wins the election. Can you put some of this in perspective and take us through some of the evening's biggest takeaways?
Hi, good morning, Vlad. Well, those statistics that you just mentioned were far away from the minds of the Republicans who were speaking last night. The message coming from the RNC last night was basically, forget everything that you're seeing right now. Remember the good times. That's what you heard from Nikki Haley to Kimberly Guilfoyle to others. That was kind of the thread through all of this, because there was not this acknowledgement that the pandemic is going on and that most Americans, according to polling and in key battleground states, disapprove of the president's handling of coronavirus, of the pandemic. And so what you heard was a lot of blame on China for this virus, even from Nikki Haley saying communist China gave us this virus. And you heard a lot from the messaging of, remember when the economy was good and things were good before all of this happened to us. So there wasn't really a message of here's how we're going to move forward during the pandemic, here's how we get out of it. It was mostly remember everything that happened before all of this and kind of stick with that. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, voters disapprove in polling of the president's handling of the coronavirus, but also the one strong suit or one card that the president has to play in his reelection bid is on the economy, because in polling we see that Trump still leads Biden on the economy. So voters are willing to give him kind of the benefit of the doubt that things might have been okay before all of this. But what you've been hearing from Democrats is that the economy hasn't been working for everybody, and the pandemic has exposed the layers and layers and layers of how there are pandemics within the pandemic within the pandemic. And so you saw a very different view from Republicans about the way things are than you heard from Democrats last week.
I think one of the more memorable speakers last night was Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, and he talked about his family's ability to achieve the American dream essentially in one generation. I want to play a little bit of that sound.
Our family went from cotton to Congress in one lifetime. And that's why I believe the next American century can be better than the last. There are millions of families just like mine all across this nation, full of potential, seeking to live the American dream. And I'm here tonight to tell you that supporting the Republican ticket gives you the best chance of making that dream a reality.
And we sort of heard something a little bit similar with Nikki Haley at the beginning of her speech as well. And this is also coming as, you know, the country is dealing with issues connected to systemic racism, issues connected to racism in policing. But President Trump is sort of positioning himself and continues to position himself as the law and order candidate. I'm just wondering sort of how these, what almost seems like kind of mixed messaging, how this is going over and what the goal is.
Yeah, that's a great characterization, Anne-Marie. If you take the speeches from Nikki Haley and Tim Scott that came at the end of the night and compare those to the speeches earlier in the night, you kind of had two different conventions. You know, I was thinking back to 4 years ago when I was in South Carolina in Greenville covering an endorsement of Nikki Haley for Marco Rubio, and she went on stage at this campaign event that I was at with Rubio and with Tim Scott and presented these figures as the future of the Republican Party and said, look, it looks like a Benetton commercial. Fast forward 4 years ago, and you have these two speakers supporting President Trump's re-election and a very, very different Republican Party. So while Nikki Haley and Tim Scott, I should say, his address was extremely compelling, that Cotton to Congress line, I think you'll hear a lot of, you'll hear that was a really compelling line. But it is important to note that they don't really seem to represent where the base of the party is right now, and their speeches kind of reflected an acknowledgement of that it has changed in the past 4 years. And I was also looking back at our polling from the summer, CBS polling on race relations, and you saw a majority of Americans think race relations have gotten worse. A majority think that it is harder for Black Americans to get ahead than white Americans. So you see those disparities, and you also see the president not talking to that message, but instead moving further and further into this law and order message. And remember, in an interview with our own Catherine Herridge, he said that white Americans are shot by police more or killed at the hands of police more, when that is actually not true. So I think that what we saw from those two speakers last night were an effort by Republicans to present a diverse Republican Party that is speaking to a lot of these themes, but compare that to what you hear from the president himself, from his children, and from base Republicans. It's a very different message.
Well, that's a great point that you're making there, Caitlin, because as I see it, the Republican Party has now completely been reshaped in the personality of Donald Trump. And that is not my assessment. That comes from every political analyst who are both Republicans and Democrats. And you need to look no further than the fact that the Republican Party, which in years past uses these conventions, as does the Democratic Party, to affirm a series of positions that the party stands for and that the party believes in. And as you know, Caitlin, this year, for reasons that have not been made clear, the Republican Party decided to completely do away with a policy position and just essentially say that whatever President Trump is doing, we're behind. So whatever he decides, we are good with that. And that essentially means that the party has now become this party of personality, the personality of President Donald Trump. The question is, are we going to see in 2024 the party tilting towards Nikki Haley and Tim Scott or Donald Trump Jr.? Because the speeches that they delivered yesterday were very, very, very different. Donald Trump Jr. and others that came before him talking about, like Matt Gaetz, talking about MS-13 moving into your neighborhood next door and you not being able to live in your neighborhoods because there's going to be low-income housing in those neighborhoods, versus a speech that Nikki Haley and Tim Scott gave. How do you see the soul of the Republican Party battling within itself going forward?
Right, and you mentioned that platform, which is newsworthy. And also remember that President Trump received no primary challenge. He got the nomination again, and you saw moves in some states earlier in the primary process to kind of do away with the primary and support Trump. So he received no pushback from his party, a united party. And we see that in polling as well, that Republicans are largely united, a majority united around Donald Trump. And majorities agree with his assessment of the way things are. We saw that in our CBS News Battleground Tracker polling released over the weekend, that people, the Republicans reported that they did not believe the number of deaths were accurate of coronavirus, and they thought that things were better off 4 years ago. I was thinking back also to the conventions of last election, where Donald Trump gave a very grim assessment of the country. And I was kind of going back through my reporting and how I reported at the time, and I remember looking at the time, the majority of the country thought the country was going in the wrong track. Well, we see that now as well. The difference is, last time around, Obama still had majority approval ratings, or at least half the country approved of him. Here we have the president's approval ratings have stayed stagnant throughout his presidency. So that's something to kind of look for as you go forward. And Republicans have been saying, look, we just want to talk about the economy. 90% in our polls want Republicans to talk about positive visions from Pence and Donald Trump. But you hear that contrasted with the rhetoric that you heard from some of the main speakers last night. And that paints a very different picture of where the Republican Party is right now.
I also want to ask you about something else that's sort of unique for this convention. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, is going to be speaking. He's speaking from Jerusalem. I don't think we've ever seen a sitting diplomat speak at a convention. Can we just talk about how this is a little bit different, what the purpose of it is, and you know, sort of the impact?
That's right, and this comes a month after there have been reports that Mike Pompeo was warning U.S. diplomats not to get involved in politics, not to engage in politics. And so here you have him not only on a foreign trip abroad, engaging in politics, but using that position to speak on behalf of the Republican Party, and that's what this convention is. So breaking with precedent there, and also the president is supposed to give a speech at the White House as his RNC party nomination speech later this week, which is also breaking with the norms.
Caitlin, I know we'll have you back on as the convention continues, but thank you so much for giving us a little bit of a deep dive there.